Memphis, summer of 1969. The King had returned. After the firestorm of the '68 comeback special, Elvis was back in the studio, chasing a new sound, a deeper truth in his voice. RCA's walls trembled with anticipation, musicians tense, engineers ready, the air so charged it felt like lightning waiting to strike. Every note mattered. Every breath was history in the making. And then, laughter. Not from fans, not from his band. A rough chuckle from the corner, belonging to a man in work boots and a stained shirt. An electrician, there only to fix the lights, shaking his head with scorn. That ain't singing, that's whining. The room froze. Instruments fell silent. Musicians shifted in their seats, caught between outrage and disbelief. How could anyone say that here, in this sacred space, to this man? Elvis turned slowly, his eyes locking on the intruder. No anger, no shouting, just a calm, dangerous quiet. Everyone braced for an explosion. Instead, Elvis tilted his head, his voice soft but cutting. "Tell me something, friend. You ever sung yourself?" The air thickened, every ear straining. The electrician smirked, defiant. "At least when I do, it's honest. Not all this showbiz glitter." The musicians held their breath. The King only smiled, almost daring. "Well then," Elvis said, stepping closer, "let's find out which of us sings honest." And in that moment, the night turned. Let us know where you're watching from. And we hope you enjoy the story. The studio smelled of warm metal and dust from heavy cables stretched across the concrete floor. RCA's equipment blinked with red and green signals, the tape reels already loaded, waiting to spin. The air conditioners hummed with a steady, almost hypnotic vibration that filled the background like a low drone. The musicians, guitarists, drummer, bass player, and backup singers were still adjusting themselves after the last take. It was late, the night thick beyond the small windows, but the room pulsed with something alive. The residue of triumph was still in the air from Elvis's televised '68 special. Everyone in the room felt it. The knowledge that he had not only returned, but returned with a fire sharper than before. That program had changed the conversation. It was no longer about whether Elvis Presley was finished. The question now was, what would he do next? And in this studio, under the fluorescent glare, they waited for the answer. Elvis stood near the microphone, collar unbuttoned, hair slightly damp with sweat, his presence both casual and magnetic. He didn't need to command the room with words. Every shift of his weight, every narrowing of his eyes seemed to draw focus. He was preparing to sing, the musicians tense, listening for his cue. The engineer's hand hovered over the controls. It was the kind of silence that prickled in the ears. Expectation, reverence, nerves. That was when it happened. From the corner, where a man in a gray work shirt had been crouched over a panel of wires, came a sharp, unguarded burst of laughter. At first, it seemed almost out of place, like static in the speakers. Heads turned toward him. The man straightened up slowly, wiping his hands on his trousers, a coil of cable still dangling from his grip. He was older than most in the room, with a square jaw, weather-beaten skin, and a kind of heavy solidity that spoke of years on construction sites or factory floors. His badge marked him as part of the technical crew, an electrician brought in earlier to check the circuits when one of the monitors failed. No one expected him to linger, and no one expected him to speak. Yet now, his voice carried easily over the equipment's drone. "Lord Almighty," he said with a rough chuckle, "is this what they call singin' nowadays?" Back when men opened their mouths, you knew it was a voice. Not all this television shine. The words sliced through the charged quiet. Musicians froze, some shifting uncomfortably. The backup singers exchanged quick, uneasy glances. It was not only the bluntness, it was the tone, thick with scorn. For a moment, all that could be heard was the hum of machines and the faint buzz of the fluorescent tubes. Elvis didn't move. His eyes, which a second earlier had been closed in preparation, opened and fixed on the man. No flare of anger, no instant retort. He studied him as though trying to understand not only the insult, but the man who had given it. The guitarist's hand slipped nervously along his strings, not striking a chord. One of the horn players muttered something under his breath, but no one dared to challenge the intruder outright. They all turned their attention to Elvis, waiting for the explosion. He had every reason to lash out. He was the star. This was his space, his session. An insult here was an insult magnified 100 times, but Elvis's expression remained strangely calm. His lips curved faintly, not in amusement, not in disdain, more like recognition. He leaned one elbow on the microphone stand and spoke in a voice low but steady, carrying perfectly to every ear. "Tell me something, friend," he said. "Have you ever sung yourself?" The electrician blinked, taken off guard by the question. He shifted his weight, cleared his throat. There was a pause, as though he considered brushing it off. But pride was a stubborn thing, especially when all eyes were on him. "I sing," he said at last, his tone defensive. "Maybe not with all your horns and flashing lights, but I sing honest. Don't need no fancy fanfare." That sentence landed like a thrown wrench. The musicians stiffened. This wasn't just mockery now. It was a direct challenge. To say Elvis's voice was less than honest, to dismiss his music as spectacle, was to wound him where it mattered most. For a long beat, silence returned. The reels of tape spun idly, recording nothing but the quiet tension. The hum of the air conditioner seemed louder than ever. And then Elvis smiled. Not wide, not mocking, just a curve of his mouth that carried both patience and something daring. He straightened, stepped closer to the man without raising his voice, and said, "All right then. Why don't we put that to the test? Let's see who sings honest." The room shifted like a sudden change in temperature. Musicians exchanged startled glances. The engineer's hand dropped from the board in disbelief. No one had expected this. They had expected anger, dismissal, maybe a harsh word to send the man packing. Instead, Elvis had thrown open a door to something dangerous, unpredictable. The electrician let out a dry laugh, but there was less confidence in it now. He hadn't anticipated being called out. He had expected maybe a glare, maybe silence, certainly not an invitation. The gaze of everyone in the studio pressed down on him. Pride demanded he not back away, though every instinct screamed that he'd stepped too far. "You serious?" he asked, voice rough. "Serious as a heartbeat," Elvis replied softly. "You said you sing honest. Let's hear it." The tension thickened, palpable as the smoke curling from the ashtray on the piano. The musicians stood poised, as if caught between disbelief and anticipation. Somewhere in the corner, a reporter from the local paper, granted rare access to observe the king at work, raised his eyebrows, sensing something rare was about to unfold. The electrician's hand twitched at his side, his jaw clenched. His pride had led him into the spotlight, but now the spotlight burned hotter than he'd imagined. And still Elvis's gaze held him, calm but unyielding, offering neither escape nor cruelty. The studio was utterly still, as though the walls themselves waited for the answer. For a moment, no one moved. The electrician stood rigid, under the sudden weight of his own words, sweat darkening the fabric at his chest. Around him, the studio breathed like a living thing. The faint tick of a metronome still switched on, the whir of tape reels, the low static of amplifiers not yet silenced. Every pair of eyes followed the silent standoff. Musicians, sound engineers, even the lone reporter scribbling furiously in the corner. Elvis stepped back toward the microphone, tapping it gently with one finger, as though to prove it was alive and waiting. "Let's hear it," he said again, his voice unhurried, stripped of mockery. Then, turning to the control booth, he lifted his hand. "Switch on a mic for our guest. Give him a fair shot." The room shifted. Chairs scraped as musicians adjusted. A backup singer stifled a nervous laugh, not out of malice, but disbelief. The engineer hesitated, hand hovering over the board, glancing toward the producer for guidance. The producer only nodded once, silently, and the switch was thrown. Another microphone hummed to life, standing ready in the corner. The electrician looked at it as though it were a gallows. His jaw tightened, his hand still gripping the length of cable he had been working on. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. Pride warred with common sense. He hadn't planned on being a spectacle. He had only voiced what had been gnawing at him, a bitterness about the world of stardom and spectacle that he never belonged to. But now, to refuse would be worse than backing down. It would mark him as a coward in front of men who lived by sound and courage. Slowly, reluctantly, he set the coil of cable aside and walked toward the mic. His boots thudded against the floor in a rhythm louder than any drum beat. He positioned himself, awkward, stiff, unaccustomed to standing under the scrutiny of so many. His fingers brushed the cool metal of the stand. For the first time, his eyes darted toward Elvis, searching for a sign. Mockery, condescension, anything. But all he found was calm, steady encouragement, like a gambler sliding the dice across the table, waiting for the throw. Elvis nodded to the musicians. "Give him something raw, blues in A." The guitarist struck the first chord, lazy and heavy, bending the string until it moaned. The drummer tapped in a shuffle rhythm, the bass climbing in behind. It was unpolished, alive, the kind of sound born in juke joints and back porches long before neon marquees. The room filled with smoke and memory. The electrician's throat worked as he gathered courage. And then, to the surprise of everyone present, a voice came out. Rough, cracked at the edges, but carrying weight like a steel beam. It wasn't trained, it wasn't pretty, but it was real. A voice that had known long hours and hard labor. He sang a fragment of an old blues standard, words bent by his own experience, his tone gravelly, his rhythm unrefined yet compelling. The room, expecting embarrassment, leaned forward instead. The horn player raised his brows. One of the backing singers, herself a veteran of gospel choirs, nodded faintly. Even the reporter, who had been prepared for a humiliating anecdote, froze mid-scribble. And Elvis smiled. When the man's verse ended, Elvis didn't clap or smirk. He simply stepped into the music, took his turn. His voice entered the space like a floodlight cutting through night. He didn't push, didn't showboat. He let the note bloom slowly, pure and resonant, filling every gap the rougher voice had left. The power of it made the very air vibrate, so that the glass window of the control booth trembled faintly. It wasn't volume, it was presence. A tone that seemed to come from someplace deeper than lungs and throat, something older, more elemental. The electrician faltered, momentarily forgetting to breathe. For the first time, his defiance cracked into awe. He looked around, saw the musicians caught in a trance, their eyes locked on Elvis as though the song itself had grown a spine and stood among them. The verse passed back to him, and he stumbled through a reply, voice wavering now, pride clashing with humility. The two voices, so different, one like rough stone, the other like clear water, wove together in an unplanned duet. Imperfect, unbalanced, yet magnetic. And then, just as the energy built to a point where it seemed the walls themselves might shake, the door at the far end opened with a squeal of hinges. A man in a brown jacket and loosened tie slipped in, clutching a notepad. He was younger than most, glasses sliding down his nose, the look of someone not quite sure if he belonged here. The studio assistant had let him through by mistake, assuming his press badge gave him clearance. He stopped short as the sound hit him. This strange, unrepeatable duel of voices. His eyes widened. Without hesitation, he opened his notebook and began to write, recognizing instinctively that he had stumbled into something that would never be staged again. The jam rolled to a stop, the instruments falling silent one by one until only the tape reels spun, recording the echo of what had happened. The electrician's face burned red, caught between pride and humiliation. He half expected laughter now, jeers, mock applause. Instead, the silence was reverent, as though something sacred had passed between them. Elvis leaned on the stand again, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow, eyes twinkling with a mischief that softened the tension. "Not bad," he said quietly, and the words hung in the air like a strange blessing. The electrician swallowed hard, but said nothing. He had entered the moment with scorn. He now stood emptied, shaken, forced to confront something larger than himself, and though he would never admit it aloud, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The reporter kept writing, his pen scratching furiously. He didn't yet know how he would frame the story, but he knew this much. History had just leaned in through a half-open door and whispered to him, and everyone else in the room sensed it too. When the last vibration of the bass faded into stillness, no one moved. The tape reels clicked softly as they slowed, the only sound in a room that moments earlier had pulsed with raw, unguarded life. It was as if the music itself had left a ghost in the air, something fragile that no one dared disturb. The electrician lowered his head, his rough hands hanging uselessly at his sides. His chest rose and fell quickly, as though he had just finished hauling heavy lumber. The adrenaline of defiance had burned away, leaving him exposed. He had wanted to prove a point, to puncture the myth of celebrity with the weight of his own blunt honesty. But standing beside Elvis, he had felt the earth shift. The musicians stared at him, not with ridicule, but with a kind of startled respect. The horn player polished his mouthpiece slowly, buying time to process what had happened. The drummer sat motionless, sticks across his knees, still hearing the echo of Elvis's note that had seemed to rise above the walls and linger in the rafters. The backup singers exchanged hushed glances, eyes darting from Elvis to the electrician, as if trying to reconcile two worlds colliding. The reporter, half hidden behind his notebook, scribbled furiously. His pen tore at the paper, desperate to capture words that might preserve this moment before it dissolved into smoke. He didn't fully understand music, not the way the men with instruments did, but he understood the rarity of what he had just seen. A star willingly lowering himself into the mud of risk, and finding gold there. Elvis stepped forward, the quiet authority in his movements commanding attention. His boots tapped lightly against the studio floor. He stopped in front of the electrician, who stood rooted like a schoolboy called to the principal's office. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath, bracing for dismissal, or perhaps a gentle but cutting rebuke. Instead, Elvis extended his hand. "Thank you," he said simply. His voice carried no edge, only sincerity. The electrician blinked. For a second, he did not respond, as though the gesture itself were a trick. But Elvis's eyes were steady, unwavering, and finally, slowly, the man lifted his rough palm and placed it against his. The handshake was brief but firm, skin against skin, calloused fingers meeting the hands of a man who, though adorned in fame, had once known poverty and labor himself. "You reminded me," Elvis said, his voice lower now, meant only for those closest, though the whole room strained to hear. "Reminded me where it all begins. Singing isn't about lights or cameras. It's about telling the truth, plain and simple." The words struck deeper than the music. Some of the musicians shifted, uncomfortable, as if the raw honesty pressed too close to their own guarded ambitions. The reporter froze, his pen hovering, uncertain if he should write down something spoken in such intimacy. The electrician's throat tightened. His eyes, weathered by years of long shifts and hard living, glistened for a moment. He opened his mouth, searching for a retort, but what came out instead was halting, almost ashamed. "I used to want it," he muttered. "Used to think I could make something of a voice. But life don't leave you much room for that. You take a job, you keep the lights on, you forget." A hush settled again, thicker now. He had not meant to confess it, not in front of strangers, not in front of the king of rock and roll himself. Yet the words had slipped out, torn loose by the force of honesty that Elvis had drawn into the room. Elvis studied him for a long moment, expression unreadable. Then he nodded, as if confirming something only he understood. "Well," he said quietly, "then maybe it's time you remembered." The electrician swallowed hard, caught between shame and gratitude. He had expected humiliation, but instead he had been handed a mirror, and in it, for the first time in years, he had glimpsed the outline of the boy he once was, standing in front of a cracked mirror, singing to nobody. The producer cleared his throat, shifting awkwardly, reminding everyone that the night was not infinite, that the schedule still ticked on. The musicians began to stir, fiddling with their instruments, pretending not to have been shaken to their core. The engineer's hands returned to the board, though his movements were stiff, as if afraid to break the spell. But the reporter couldn't let go. He scribbled again, faster now, sentences tumbling out, shaping the story in his head. The king humbled, the worker uplifted. Music stripped bare of glamour. He could already see the headline in the Memphis Morning Edition. His heart raced with the hunger of a scoop that would be talked about in bars and barber shops alike. Elvis, noticing the frantic scratching of the pen, turned his head. His gaze locked with the reporter's, steady and pointed. For a brief instant, the young man felt pinned, as though Elvis could see not just the ink on his page, but the entire intention behind it. Elvis's lips curved faintly, not in a smile, not in anger, something in between, a warning disguised as kindness. "Some things," Elvis said softly, though the words carried across the room, "ain't for papers." The reporter froze, caught red-handed. He glanced down at his notebook, then back up, unsure if he should tear out the page, unsure if the king was serious or only hinting. The electrician, still clutching the echo of Elvis's words in his chest, broke the tension by muttering, I'm sorry." His voice was hoarse, nearly inaudible. "Shouldn't have laughed. Shouldn't have. I don't know what I was thinking." But Elvis only placed a hand on his shoulder, firm and reassuring. "Don't be sorry," he said. "You gave us something real tonight. That's worth more than polite silence." The man nodded, eyes lowered, ashamed and grateful all at once. Around them, the session stirred back to life, but a tremor lingered in the air, a sense that what had just happened would ripple far beyond these walls. Whether or not Elvis wanted it written, it was already imprinted in the minds of everyone present. And in the corner, the reporter's pen hesitated over the paper once more, torn between the king's request and the irresistible pulse of history demanding to be told. The streets of Memphis carried their own rhythm at the end of the 60s. Neon signs buzzed above smoky bars, jukeboxes spilled out Sam Cooke and Otis Redding, and the river carried the scent of industry mixed with humidity. On Beale Street, men in work boots rubbed shoulders with soldiers just back from Vietnam. Students talked politics in low voices, and everywhere music threaded itself into daily life. It was a city divided by struggle, but united by sound. In a cramped office above a diner near Union Avenue, the young reporter who had witnessed the studio confrontation bent over his desk. A single lamp cast his shadow across stacks of notes, cigarette smoke curling in the stagnant air. Elvis's warning, "Some things ain't for papers," echoed in his ears. But the pull of the story was stronger than guilt. He knew what he had heard, what he had seen. The greatest star of his time meeting an ordinary laborer on equal ground. Not with arrogance, but with generosity. He wrote feverishly, not about humiliation or conflict, but about humanity. His sentences painted Elvis not as an untouchable idol, but as a man willing to step down from the pedestal and sing shoulder to shoulder with someone society ignored. He described the electrician's coarse but honest voice, the trembling silence that followed, and the simple handshake that sealed the moment. To the reporter, this wasn't scandal. It was revelation. By morning, the presses rolled. Ink soaked into cheap paper, headlines screamed local politics and crime, but tucked inside was a column with the title, "When the King Listened." It wasn't front-page news, but it spread quickly, passed in barber shops, folded into lunch boxes, discussed in bars where tired men leaned over beer-stained counters. Memphis readers found themselves talking not about fame, but about respect, about a star who didn't crush the small man, but lifted him, even briefly. The electrician discovered the article in the most ordinary way. At breakfast, a co-worker slapped the paper down on the workbench, grinning. "Ain't this you, Joe? Says here, you sang with Elvis." The men around the shop burst into laughter, slapping his back, some mocking, some impressed. Joe, because that was his name, felt his face burn. His private embarrassment, his lapse of pride, had become public property. That evening, at home, he read the article himself. The words were kinder than he expected, but seeing his name in print unsettled him. His wife asked cautious questions, trying to hide pride behind skepticism. "So, are you a singer now?" she teased softly, but he only shook his head, folding the paper too quickly, his jaw set. He didn't want laughter to follow him onto the streets or into the factory. Yet the article did more than embarrass him. A phone call came the next day from a club owner on Beale Street, an old blues joint with sticky floors and crooked neon letters. The man's voice rasped over the receiver. "Folks want to hear the guy who stood up to Presley. You got guts, and maybe a little grit in your throat. Why don't you come down and sing a set?" Joe almost hung up. The idea seemed ridiculous. He hadn't sung in front of strangers since he was a teenager. But the invitation stuck in his mind, clawing at the corners of his pride. He told himself it would be one night, just to silence the whispers, to prove he wasn't afraid. That Friday, he walked into the club. The air inside was thick with smoke and the tang of whiskey. A few dozen patrons leaned against scarred tables, laughing too loud, eyes already glazed with drink. A guitar hummed lazily from the stage, where the house band waited. Nobody here wore diamonds or silk. This was not Las Vegas. This was Memphis stripped raw, where applause was earned note by note. When Joe climbed the small stage, his palms slick with sweat, he saw the curiosity in their faces. Some knew him from the paper. Others only knew that a working man was about to risk humiliation. He cleared his throat, nodded to the band, and when the first blues riff rolled out, he let his voice follow. It was rough, uneven, but it carried something real. A few heads lifted from their drinks. Someone clapped in rhythm. The song ended with no standing ovation, but with honest applause, and in that moment, Joe realized it hadn't killed him. In fact, it had awakened something. What he didn't know was that Elvis, weeks later, stumbled across the very article he had asked to be buried. Late one night in Graceland, flipping through papers idly, his eyes caught the column. He read it once, then again, lips pressed together in thought. The reporter had broken his word, but the piece wasn't cruel. It was reverent. It didn't diminish him. It showed him as human. But Elvis wasn't thinking of himself. His mind went back to Joe, the man with the cracked, gravelly voice who had dared to laugh, then dared to sing. Against his own instinct for privacy, Elvis felt compelled to find him again, not to scold, but to speak, to see what had become of that small spark. Outside, Memphis hummed on, factory whistles, jukeboxes, sirens in the distance. In the middle of it all, two men's lives, from such different worlds, were tied together by a night that neither could escape. And while Joe wiped sweat from his brow after another long shift, unaware that Elvis was thinking of him, the city itself seemed to wait, as though sensing another meeting was inevitable. The club didn't look like much from the outside. A flickering sign buzzed above the door, half the letters burned out so that it read, "Only Blue Room." The sidewalk was cracked, gum flattened into its surface, and the faint smell of fried catfish drifted out from a cafe next door. It was the kind of place where paychecks disappeared in beer glasses, where the regulars claimed the same stools night after night. Inside, the air was heavier. Neon lights glowed against smoke-stained walls, and the stage was little more than a wooden riser nailed together decades earlier. The crowd wasn't large, 40, maybe 50 people, but they weren't gentle. Memphis club audiences never were. They clapped if you made them feel something. They talked over you if you didn't. Joe, still the electrician to those who had read the paper, was on that stage, gripping the microphone stand like it might keep him from drowning. He had accepted the owner's invitation reluctantly, and now, under the gaze of strangers, he wondered if he had been foolish to agree. The band struck up a slow blues progression, and his voice came out rough, uneven. It was music without polish, shaped more by cigarettes and long nights than by training. Some in the crowd nodded, tapping the tables in rhythm. Others smirked, waiting for him to stumble. Joe fought to keep steady, to keep from collapsing under their scrutiny. And then, in the haze of the smoky room, his eyes caught a figure near the back. A man in plain clothes, black jacket, open shirt, no glitter, no entourage, but the set of his shoulders, the glint of his hair under the neon, were unmistakable. Elvis. Joe faltered mid-line. His throat closed, and the words tangled. The guitarist shot him a sharp glance, urging him to push through. He did, but his confidence slipped with every note. The song ended in a half-hearted finish, scattered applause filling the gap. Joe stepped off stage, head lowered, heat rising in his face. He didn't have time to hide. Elvis was already making his way forward, weaving through the crowd. Conversations hushed as people recognized him, first in disbelief, then in awe. The king of rock and roll in this place, without bodyguards, without spectacle. It was a sight no one expected. Joe braced for mockery, for a smile that would slice sharper than any insult. Instead, Elvis stopped in front of him, hand resting lightly on his arm. "You've got something," Elvis said quietly, his voice low enough for only Joe to hear. "Something money can't buy. But you've got to find the truth in it. Right now, you're hiding." Joe swallowed, his chest tight. He wanted to laugh, to dismiss the words, but they cut too close. He had hidden, behind sarcasm, behind bitterness, behind the safety of labor that asked nothing of his soul. On stage, that same instinct had betrayed him. "I'm no singer," Joe muttered. Elvis's eyes didn't waver. "Neither was I once. Just a kid with too much feeling, singing louder than the church could hold. They laughed at me too. But it isn't about being a singer. It's about telling the truth with your voice." The words stunned him. This wasn't the reply of a celebrity brushing off a heckler. It was an invitation. One Joe didn't know if he wanted. Elvis reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. Inside was a ticket, crisp and white, with the logo of the International Hotel in Las Vegas. A concert date printed bold across the center. "I want you to see what truth looks like when it fills a room," Elvis said. "Come to Vegas. Watch the stage. See if you can still call it just a show." Joe stared at the ticket, his hand trembling as he took it. The absurdity hit him. A factory worker with calloused palms holding a pass into a world of neon, orchestras, and thousands of screaming voices. He looked up, expecting a wink or a smirk, some sign that it was all a joke. But Elvis's face was calm, steady, unflinching. The crowd around them had fallen into whispers, heads craning to watch. Some gaped, others laughed nervously. For them, it was spectacle. The king speaking to a nobody in a rundown bar. But for Joe, it was a private earthquake. Elvis gave his arm one last squeeze, then turned to leave. His presence vanished into the night as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the neon and the hum of Beale Street. Joe remained at the edge of the stage, the envelope still in his grip. He could feel the eyes on him, the silent questions, the skepticism. Was it a real invitation or a cruel trick? Was he being lifted up or set up to fall harder? He stepped outside, the cool night air hitting his sweat-soaked shirt. Neon flickered across his face as he unfolded the ticket once more, staring at the date, the city, the possibility. A chance or a trap? He couldn't tell. But in that moment, standing under the broken glow of the club's sign, Joe knew his life had tilted onto a path he hadn't chosen, one that scared him more than anything else ever had. And somewhere deep inside, beneath all the fear, a spark of something he thought long dead flickered to life. The first thing Joe noticed was the glow. Long before the bus pulled into the city, the desert night lit up with a halo of neon, as if the earth itself had sprouted an artificial sunrise. Casinos lined the strip like monuments to excess, their facades glittering in impossible colors, promising jackpots and instant salvation. It was the early 70s, and Las Vegas was a fever dream of America, part carnival, part cathedral. Joe stepped down from the Greyhound with his duffel bag slung over one shoulder, boots coated in the dust of states he barely remembered passing through. He had never been west of Arkansas before, and now he stood in a place that looked like another planet. Women in sequined gowns drifted past him. Men in tuxedos hailed cabs, and billboards, 20 stories high, flashed names in lights: Sinatra, Davis, Presley. His calloused hands tightened on the strap of his bag. He felt like a laborer who had accidentally wandered into a palace. The International Hotel loomed larger than anything he had ever seen. Its facade gleamed white under the floodlights, a towering symbol of ambition and spectacle. Inside, marble floors shone beneath chandeliers, and the air carried the scent of perfume, money, and cigarettes. Bellhops darted like insects, polished and efficient. Every sound echoed, as though amplified. Every laugh belonged to someone rich. Every glance at Joe reminded him he didn't fit. He almost turned back. The weight of the ticket in his pocket felt absurd, like a prank still waiting to be revealed. But then, in the crush of guests heading toward the showroom, he saw him. Elvis. Not in rhinestones, not in a spotlight, just in a tailored jacket, moving through the hall with the ease of a man at home. And when Elvis spotted him, he broke into a grin, walking straight over as if Joe were the only person in the crowd. "Glad you made it," Elvis said, clapping him lightly on the back. "Come on, you'll see better from backstage." Joe followed in a daze, led through corridors alive with movement, dancers adjusting costumes, stagehands lugging cables, musicians tuning instruments. The air buzzed with the energy of anticipation. He caught glimpses of gold lame jackets, trays of champagne, the glitter of Vegas compressed into a labyrinth of hallways. It was chaos, but purposeful chaos, like a machine building toward eruption. When they reached the wings of the stage, Joe stopped short. Beyond the curtain stretched a sea of people. Thousands of faces, blurred together under the glow of chandeliers and spotlights. The murmur of the audience was like a living tide, restless, waiting. The sight alone nearly knocked the air from his chest. Elvis turned to him, calm, almost playful. "You said you wanted honesty. Watch close." The band struck the first note, and the room transformed. The curtain lifted, the lights exploded, and Elvis stepped forward. The crowd erupted, a roar so loud it shook the floor beneath Joe's boots. Women screamed, men clapped until their palms turned red, and cameras flashed like lightning. Yet amid the frenzy, Elvis moved as if speaking directly to each soul, his voice carrying not just to the back row, but into every chest, into every secret longing. Joe leaned against the wall, overwhelmed. He had seen singers before, in bars and church halls, but this was something different. Elvis didn't just sing. He filled the room with himself, with a force that dissolved the line between man and myth. The orchestra swelled, brass blaring, drums thunderous, but his voice rose above it all, commanding, tender, defiant. Halfway through the set, when the audience was already boiling with energy, Elvis did something Joe hadn't expected. He paused, scanning the crowd with a half-smile, then leaned toward the microphone. "Tonight," he said, "there's someone here who reminded me that music doesn't belong to stages or stars. It belongs to anyone brave enough to open their mouth and sing their truth." The spotlight shifted, searching the hall, and before Joe realized what was happening, it landed on him. Faces turned, whispers rippled through the crowd. He felt his knees weaken, heat climbing into his face. Thousands of strangers were staring at him, the working man with nothing but calluses and a half-broken voice. Elvis didn't mock him. He didn't set him up to be laughed at. Instead, he let the applause rise, not for himself, but for the man he had chosen to acknowledge. The ovation rolled like thunder, not because the crowd knew Joe's story, but because Elvis's word carried enough weight to make them believe. Joe's eyes stung. He clenched his fists, resisting the urge to flee. In that moment, under the crushing glow of Vegas lights, he understood what Elvis meant by truth. It wasn't about polish or fame. It was about daring to stand there, naked of excuses, and still be seen. The show surged on, Elvis reclaiming the stage with energy that seemed inhuman. Joe remained in the wings, shaking, unable to pull his gaze away. The sound, the spectacle, the devotion. It was a world he had never believed in, and yet it was happening before his eyes. And though he knew he didn't belong, for the first time, he didn't feel like an intruder. When the final note rang out, the audience exploded into cheers, the walls trembling with adoration. Elvis bowed, sweat pouring down his face, but his eyes found Joe again, steady, as if to say, "Do you believe me now?" Joe's chest tightened. He didn't have an answer yet, but he knew he would never be able to look at music, or himself, the same way again. The roar of the crowd was still ringing in Joe's ears as he followed Elvis into the labyrinth behind the stage. The velvet curtain had barely fallen, but already the backstage corridors pulsed with motion. Technicians coiling cables, dancers laughing breathlessly, managers barking instructions into phones. The air was thick with the mingled scents of sweat, champagne, and expensive cologne. Joe trailed close, dazed, the applause echoing inside his chest long after it had ended. Elvis walked ahead with the easy gait of someone who had given his all and was somehow ready to give more. When they entered the dressing room, the shift was immediate. No longer the roar of thousands, but a smaller kingdom of musicians, friends, and hangers-on crowding into a space too tight for its purpose. The room glowed with vanity lights surrounding mirrors, trays of fruit and bottles of champagne crowding the counters. Laughter filled the air, tinged with relief after the high-wire act of performance. Women in sequined dresses perched on chairs. Musicians loosened ties and unfastened collars, their bodies humming with post-show adrenaline. Joe hovered near the doorway, shoulders hunched, the rough fabric of his work jacket stark among silk shirts and velvet blazers. He felt like a man who had wandered into a dream he didn't belong to. A voice cut across the chatter. "So this is him, huh? The electrician who sang the blues with the king." One of the men lounging near the bar smirked, his words coated in sarcasm. A ripple of amusement passed through the group. Another voice chimed in. "Come on, let's hear it, fella. Give us a tune. Show us what made Elvis drag you all the way out here." The laughter stung sharper than any applause had soothed. Joe's throat tightened, and he stared at the floor, fists curling at his sides. The same shame that had haunted him since the newspaper article now pressed heavier than ever. He wanted to disappear, to melt back into the walls of the factory, where at least no one expected anything of him. But before he could stammer an excuse, Elvis's voice sliced through the room. Firm, unyielding. "That's enough." The chatter died instantly. Elvis set his drink down, turning to face the group with eyes that no longer carried the softness of the stage. His jaw was tight, his voice low but edged with steel. "He's not here to entertain you. He's my guest. You laugh at him, you laugh at me." The silence that followed was heavier than the crowd's roar had been. A few people shifted uncomfortably, suddenly fascinated by their glasses. Joe dared to glance up and saw Elvis watching him, not with pity, but with solidarity. Elvis crossed the room, the sequins of his stage suit still catching the light, though his movements were slow now, deliberate. He stopped in front of Joe, his hand resting briefly on his shoulder. "Don't mind them," he said softly, "just for him, or they forget too easy what it feels like to be on the other side." Joe swallowed, unable to find words. His chest ached with the weight of humiliation and gratitude tangled together. And then, unexpectedly, Elvis turned back to the room. His voice shifted, not sharp now, but raw, confessional, as though he had decided to expose something he had kept locked away. "You all think I was born to this," he began. But I wasn't. I was a boy who sang too loud in a little church where folks wanted neat hymns, not feelings spilling out all over the place. They laughed at me, said I didn't know how to sing proper, that I was making a fool of myself. I went home ashamed, wondering if I should ever open my mouth again. The room fell still. No one dared interrupt. Elvis let the silence linger, his eyes distant, fixed on a memory only he could see. I learned something from that. Laughter don't kill you. What kills you is believing it. His gaze shifted back to Joe. You know what I'm talking about. The words sank into Joe like nails. He did know. Every time he had mocked others, every time he had scoffed at dreams, it had been armor against the truth. That once he had wanted to sing, and he had buried it deep under work and duty. And now, here he stood, pulled back into that vulnerable place by the one man he had tried to ridicule. The dressing room exhaled at last, some nodding, others glancing away, their own shame stirred by the confession. A guitarist cleared his throat and muttered an apology, pouring himself another drink. The tension loosened, but Joe remained frozen, pinned in the middle of the storm Elvis had calmed. When the noise rose again, more subdued this time, Joe stepped aside into a darker corner, his breath uneven. He felt stripped bare, not by mockery, but by recognition. Elvis, after greeting a few friends and signing a napkin for one of the women, found him again. His face had softened, though his eyes still carried that strange weight, as if he were carrying not only his own burdens, but those of everyone who ever sang out of place. "Don't let them scare you off," Elvis said quietly. "Truth ain't pretty most of the time, but it's all we've got." Joe nodded faintly, words stuck in his throat. The hum of the dressing room pressed around him, laughter, glasses clinking, fragments of conversations, but he felt as though he stood in a private space carved out by Elvis's words. For the first time in years, Joe didn't feel mocked. He felt seen. And yet, behind that recognition, a shadow loomed. The question of what he would do with it. The casino never truly slept. Even at 3 a.m, the strip roared with neon and noise, dice clattering against green felt, showgirls striding past drunken tourists, bells of slot machines chiming in endless loops. But beyond the casino floor, in the quiet corridors backstage at the International Hotel, silence pressed like a blanket. Joe walked alone down one of those dim hallways, the distant thunder of the crowd still buzzing in his blood. He had left the dressing room early, slipping away, while the others poured champagne and told stories too glamorous for him to understand. The laughter back there felt like a different language. He carried no glass, no sparkle of victory, only the heavy confusion of a man who didn't know where he belonged. The corridor was narrow, lit by tired bulbs that flickered now and then. The scent of cigarette smoke clung to the walls. Somewhere, faintly, came the hum of the hotel's ventilation system. He leaned against the wall, shutting his eyes. Part of him wanted to vanish, to pack his bag and disappear into the night, return to Memphis and bury the whole strange detour under work and routine. It was easier to be no one. And then he heard it. At first, he thought it was memory, the echo of the concert replaying in his head. But the sound was too immediate, too fragile. A piano, faint through the walls, a single voice, soft, unguarded. Joe followed the sound, his boots echoing quietly on the linoleum. The notes grew clearer as he turned a corner, and soon he stood before a half-open door leading into a small rehearsal space. Inside, the room was dim except for a single lamp beside a grand piano. Elvis sat alone at the keys, still wearing his stage trousers, but stripped of the sequined jacket, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar. His hair hung damp over his forehead, and his voice carried into the empty space like a confession. He wasn't performing. He wasn't commanding an audience. He was simply singing to himself, low, aching, as though each word were drawn from someplace buried. The grandeur of Vegas had melted away. What remained was the boy from Tupelo, spilling the truth no crowd could ever buy. Joe stood frozen in the doorway, afraid to intrude, yet unable to leave. Something in the rawness of that sound struck him harder than the show had. This wasn't myth, wasn't spectacle. This was the core of it. The kind of singing Joe had once believed in, long before cynicism had corroded his faith. Without thinking, he stepped inside. Elvis looked up briefly, his hands never leaving the keys. Their eyes met, and instead of surprise or irritation, Elvis offered a small, almost secret smile, as if to say, "You're welcome here." Joe's throat burned. The melody lingered, fragile, waiting. He didn't plan it, but words rose from somewhere deep inside, and he began to sing, quiet at first, then stronger. His voice was rough, scarred by years of neglect, but it carried something unpolished and real. Elvis didn't stop him. Instead, he adjusted the chords, shaping the piano around Joe's voice, supporting it, lifting it. For a few minutes, the two men sang together, one voice smooth as glass, the other jagged as gravel, woven into something neither could have created alone. The room held only the two of them, yet it felt as though the world beyond the door ceased to exist. No applause, no cameras, no stage lights, just sound and silence, the honesty of two men unmasked. When the last note faded, the stillness that followed was profound. Elvis let his hands rest on the keys, eyes lowered, breathing slow. Joe swallowed hard, his chest tight, unable to believe what had just happened. "You hear that?" Elvis said finally, his voice gentle. "That's all it takes. No crowd, no paper, no spotlight, just the truth." Joe couldn't answer. His throat was too thick, his eyes stinging in a way he refused to acknowledge. For years, he had told himself that dream was gone, buried under wages and responsibility. But in that moment, in that quiet Vegas room, he realized it hadn't died at all. It had only been waiting for someone to remind him it was still alive. They sat in silence for a while longer, the faint hum of the city leaking through the walls. Outside, Las Vegas screamed its promise of wealth and glory. Inside, two men had found something far rarer, a moment of truth that no fortune could buy. When Joe finally rose to leave, Elvis didn't stop him. He only nodded, a silent agreement that what had passed between them would remain theirs alone. As Joe stepped back into the hallway, the casino's chaos seemed distant, irrelevant. For the first time in decades, he carried not bitterness, but a fragile ember of hope. The morning after the concert, the strip looked different. Neon still flickered, but the sun had begun to wash the colors out, leaving the streets strangely bare. Bellhops pushed carts of luggage across polished floors. Dealers collected chips from tables that only hours before had been alive with shouts. Joe stood at the edge of it all, ticket stub folded and refolded in his palm. The city's noise dull compared to the storm inside him. He didn't seek out Elvis again. Words felt unnecessary after what had passed in that quiet rehearsal room. Instead, before he left, he found himself face to face with the man for a final time. Not amid lights or crowd, but in a quiet corner of the hotel lobby, where the early morning smelled of strong coffee and carpet shampoo. Elvis looked tired, but his eyes carried the same calm weight. "You don't need a stage to matter," Elvis said softly. "Doesn't matter if it's one person or 10,000. Believe in your voice first. Let the rest go." He clasped Joe's hand, firm, steady, and for a moment Joe thought he saw in the king's face the same boy who once sang too loud in church, desperate to be heard. No grand farewell followed, just a nod, and the weight of words that would stay long after the city was behind him. On the bus out of Las Vegas, Joe sat by the window, watching the desert roll by in endless browns and reds. Telephone poles cut the horizon like scars. Diners flashed past with their neon signs promising best coffee in Nevada. He wasn't leaving as a new man, not the kind who traded calluses for spotlight. His job would still be waiting, his wages still needed. But he carried something invisible, a certainty that his voice, however rough, was real. He hummed softly to himself, low enough that no one else heard. Years slipped past. The world shifted. Headlines came and went. One day the news broke heavy across Memphis radios. Elvis Presley was gone. Joe heard it at the workshop, surrounded by clanging metal and the hiss of machines. He froze, wrench still in his hand, the sound of the announcer's voice tinny and unreal. For a long moment, he couldn't move. The memory of that quiet duet in Las Vegas rose inside him so vividly it hurt. Time kept moving, but the memory never dulled. On certain nights, when the factory whistle fell silent and the bars filled, Joe would wander into a tavern near Beale Street. He'd sit with a glass of whiskey, listening to jukebox songs that tried and failed to carry the weight Elvis once made effortless. Sometimes, when the night was long enough and the crowd forgiving, he'd take the small stage in the corner. No spotlight followed him, no screaming audience waited, just a dozen tired faces, the smell of beer and smoke, and the scratch of chairs against the floor. He'd clear his throat, grip the mic, and let a blues tune roll out of him. The voice was the same as always, gravelly, uneven, but it carried truth. And those who heard it, even if only for a few minutes, leaned in. Nobody in that bar knew he had once stood in a Vegas hotel room and sung shoulder to shoulder with the king. Nobody knew about the ticket, the handshake, or the words whispered in quiet corridors. But Joe did. And when he caught his own reflection in the window glass, his lips curving into a faint smile, he knew Elvis would have heard him too. The night would end, chairs turned upside down on tables, the jukebox silenced. Joe would step out into the Memphis air, cooler now, the city humming with the same rough music it always had. And though the world had lost its brightest star, Joe walked on with a private certainty. His voice had been seen, had been answered, and that was enough.